Everybody. We're going to start off. I don't know if you've noticed, but my good friend Brian Wassam here is wearing a recorder on his ear, and we've already scanned everybody's faces. We actually have two guys back there, with some parking ticket warrants, and we have somebody else whose wife just posted divorce papers online after we meshed it in with all of the publicly available data, so just so you know. No, I'm just kidding. But one of the things that we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about augmented reality. And even though we're talking about augmented reality from a crime perspective, what we're going to really talk about is that everybody here on this panel is a proponent of augmented reality, and we have a law enforcement presence here, and I'm going to explain everybody on the panel and really what is the whole purpose of us being here today. So we all are proponents of augmented reality, and as it starts rolling out more and more, there is a responsibility that we all have to protect people and at the same time use this technology to track bad guys and not give an easy blueprint to cyber criminals. And as you know, with identity theft and criminal organizations, they can capitalize on some of these new innovations with augmented reality along with a lot of other technologies such as facial recognition, such as geo-tracking and that sort of thing. So, so the way we're going to lay this out, it's going to be an hour roundtable discussion that we're going to have here, and I'm going to briefly introduce each one of our panelists, and we're going to then hear from them to give like an opening statement on their perspective from augmented reality. But the important thing is that this is going to affect everybody. And it's important from not only a government perspective, but from a law enforcement and from a legal perspective. And the other big thing is, and one of the reasons we have Brian Wassam here, is there's going to be civil issues and also criminal justice issues that come along with these new technologies. So we want to get these conversations out ahead of time so we can maybe prevent regulation. And if you listen to our keynote speaker earlier today, Mark Silva, one of the first things that he said is there's a responsibility that we all have because we know the power of facial recognition and some of the other overlaying technologies mixed in with augmented reality. So by us having that discussion early, we really will be ahead of things and push augmented reality forward. So I'm going to start off to your right. I'm going to first introduce to you Brian Wassam. Brian Wassam is an attorney from Michigan, and he's the chair of the Social Mobile and Emerging Media Practice Group, and he's at the law firm of Honnigan, Miller, Schwartz, and Cohen, and he brings a whole legal perspective here from the civil realm. Our next person up is going to be Kevin Manson, and Kevin Manson is one of the first cybercrime officers when we started seeing computer crime. So he has a very big perspective. He has a very long resume you could read online. But one of the things that Kevin brings in is that he was one of the first co-founders of a cyber portal where law enforcement from all over the world can communicate and share to protect society. So he brings a lot of very important information and a long line of experience to have these sort of panel discussions, which is very important. Dr. Edward Roche, who is one of our panelists, was unable to come today. So filling in is Brian Mullins of DACRI. And Brian, what's nice about having Brian here, and as you know with DACRI, they have a tremendous amount of experience. You can go and see some of their demos, and he'll be speaking tomorrow. But Brian also brings the experience of, before going into the private sector, he worked for the U.S. military, and he was involved in 3D structures, virtual presence and training. So it's kind of good to have one of our developers here on the panel, the CEO, to kind of give that perspective here on where this is moving and again, pushing augmented reality forward. Our next guest on the panel is Daniel Suarez, and he is a New York Times best-selling author of the book Demon, and he also has a book called Freedom, and he'll be coming out with a new book called Kill Decision. And if you have not read these books, there is a big influence of augmented reality in the first two books that I mentioned. And what's interesting to hear from Daniel Suarez's perspective is that a lot of the writings that he does is on the cusp of where this technology is moving and how it's going to influence. And it really kind of talks about some of the legal issues, the social issues that take place. So we really appreciate him on the panel. And then finally, we have David Griezbach, who is an IRS special agent. He's a criminal investigator that deals with terrorism investigations. When we start talking about virtual worlds or mixed realities, we start talking about a whole area of virtual crime that takes place and money laundering and all of those different issues too. So we've already audited everybody in the room and you're all clean, so you guys can stay, which is, no, I'm just kidding, but it's important to kind of get representatives from the federal government in on discussions. And one of the things is as Dave is from the federal government and I'm from a local police department, what we say here as our disclaimer is not necessarily the representation from our agencies that we work for. So that's pretty much our panel here. And again, we're going to talk about the emerging issues, social and civil. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to each one of our panelists to kind of make an opening statement on where they see AR and their perspective on it, their unique perspective. Yep.
Well, I'm not going to let a cop outdo me on giving disclaimers. I'm a lawyer, for Pete's sake. So I suppose I should say that nothing I say reflects the views of my firm, their clients, or anybody that they've ever met. It's just me. I'll make it brief because the real meat of this isn't going to be in our conversation. But from my perspective, I feel like we're on the cusp of a new era, really, in not only technology, but the law that goes with it. I mean, if we take half of what we say at a conference like this seriously, the impact that this technology is going to have on society and the way we interact with each other is going to be huge, at least as significant as the development of the commercial internet itself. So how can that sort of revolution not have as an equally profound effect on the laws that govern our behavior? So that's why I think it's important to have this conversation now ahead of time to see how these things are going to develop and start establishing now the norms that will govern that behavior and that technology.
My name is Kevin Manson, and I'm a webaholic. You're supposed to say hi, Kevin. Thank you. Okay. I don't have as big a teleprompter as Obama does. I have to use my iPhone here, so I apologize. I'm keeping it very close. I used to give a long-winded story about what I did at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, training probably over 100,000 federal agents over almost 20 years, and I kind of boiled it down to this. I trained law enforcement how to obey the law while they enforce it. Taught Fourth Amendment. How many of you have any concerns about law enforcement invading your privacy unnecessarily? Doesn't surprise me at all. You know, you should be as concerned about industry violating your privacy as you are the government, because you may not realize this, but the Fourth Amendment, which protects privacy, does not govern industry. The only time the Fourth Amendment is violated if somebody has a reasonable expectation of privacy and some government entity or agency invades that without proper paper, subpoena, etc. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and let me get to my teleprompter here real quick, because this is probably all I'm going to say during the entire panel, so I'll hog a little time here. In a 2001 keynote that I was privileged to do at Black Hat, have any of you ever heard of the conference Black Hat by any chance? I see some heads nodding. Oh, Bruce. Bruce does, my God. So I'm going to give you a bump here, Bruce. Well, but I co-keynoted there with a friend by the name of Bill Tafoya, who did the definitive profile of Unabomber. And when Bill was asked who the Unabomber was going to be when they caught him, he said, I think the guy's going to be a monk on a mountain in Montana. And I still don't believe it. Just absolutely amazing. But what I did at that conference, and we were filling in at the last minute for Richard Clark, who bombed out. He was cyber czar at that time. And my meme at that conference was basically this. I said, the real elite are not the people out there wreaking havoc on the internet. They're the ones that are protecting and defending it. So that's the main thing I want to cover today. One other brief thing I'll just say, and that is I ran into a friend of mine who I used to work with in my State Attorney General's office back in the 70s, named Mark Tobias. Mark owns security.org. You might want to take a look at that site if you're interested in physical security. Mark was one of these guys that was driving a Volvo around that had more antennas on it than a Russian trawler. I mean, this guy was really wired, literally, okay? So I find out that Mark was doing an investigation for Lloyd's of London, and he was coming across on the, is it the QE2? Is it Queen Elizabeth II? You know, the big ship that comes across. I said, Mark, that must have been a really neat cruise. He said, Kevin, it's not a cruise, it's a crossing. I said, oh, sorry, okay. So on that crossing, he ran into a woman who introduced him to the director of Space Camp. How many of you have ever heard of Space Camp, just out of curiosity? Okay, thank you. Okay. Guess what, folks? Becoming an astronaut is not exactly a career choice these days for these kids. We need to give them something to engage them. And, you know, I've heard people say, I want to make a real difference in my life. Well, that's not enough for me. I want to make a real good difference as best I can. Well, Tommy Blackwell was the director of Space Camp for 12 years. 300,000 kids went through it. She gets together with Mark Tobias and let's build a security camp. And I said, let's do better than that. Let's build a cyberspace camp. So that's the horse I'm riding here today. And if any of you are interested in that, I'd love to talk to you because I want to engage these people, these kids. And what better way to do it than this kind of environment, this totally immersive environment. So thanks, Joe. I really appreciate the invite here. It's really great to see my buddy Bruce Sterling. But Bruce, you should have been up here in the front instead of sitting in the back. But he can escape more easily back there. So.
Hi, I'm Brian Mullins. I'm the CEO and founder of Daiquiri, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to fill in on the panel today. A lot of very interesting minds here at the table. I have a slightly different perspective as you know, my company is commercializing augmented reality. I'm very optimistic about the medium and what we can do with it. But early in my career, I did work for the military and in defense. And so I'm hoping to bring a little bit of that perspective as we talk about the possible pitfalls of the technology and what the ups and downs might be. You know, as we create a new medium and we define today what it might be a decade from now, it's good that we're having this conversation and these discussions along the way. So honored to be here.
Daniel Suarez. True that I write thrillers now, but for 20 years preceding that, I worked developing database management systems for large companies. And I couldn't help but notice how data runs the entire world. And of course, AR is very interesting from a thriller author point of view because you're projecting that data onto reality. So you could start to spin scenarios of how that might be misused. That's why it's useful from a thriller point of view. And imagine my surprise when I write that and then people in the military and the government start getting in touch with me saying, hey, this is interesting, this could really be possible, and really opened my eyes. So a lot of what I write now doesn't remain fiction very long, I find. And that's why I'm happy to come here and talk about some of my far-out scenarios and how they're apparently possible. So.
And as Joe mentioned, I'm Dave Griezbach. I'm an agent from the Internal Revenue Service. I bring kind of a unique perspective to AR as well. I've worked for several years now in kind of cybercrime, virtual currency investigations, and what I've noticed is that, and again, this is not necessarily the view of my agency, but my view, I'd like to liaison with all of you as instead of kind of, you know, having a knee-jerk reaction and, you know, some type of regulation, I prefer to, you know, work with you guys when you have issues and develop solutions to them as opposed to, you know, on a personal level as opposed to doing a one-size-fits-all solution to something.
Great. Well, as you can tell, we have a very diverse panel, and we are going to get into some good stuff. One of the real main things that also why I really wanted to be here is that there is a need for us to continue to work on different apps and different ways to use augmented reality to help people and to protect people. And that's another one of the themes. And as you heard from Kevin Manson, who's putting together this, this cyber camp that is looking to actually, if we train kids to be a part of that solution early, that we can really turn out you know, future youth that are going to really help us and move augmented reality forward. So the first question I wanted just to throw out to the panel, and we'll see where it goes, is let's talk about facial recognition, because that really is a major issue, facial recognition. But I want to talk about the good side of facial recognition and how we can use facial recognition in so many positive ways, and how even whether it's law enforcement and not necessarily Big Brother, but how we can, you know, protect society in a lot of different ways. One of the first ways I think about is somebody who might have Alzheimer's, who doesn't recognize loved ones, and now you're wearing augmented reality glasses or some sort of app where you can identify you know, your loved ones and that sort of thing, and you're not necessarily, you're opting in, so to speak, so you're not violating anybody's rights. So, if we start looking at those sort of applications, we know right now that the technology is here where facial recognition can be turned on right away. And I've spoken to a lot of vendors, and the question is how do we roll it out? How do we roll out facial recognition? Because let's face it, it is a very hot topic, and if there is some missteps while doing that and merging it with augmented reality, it really can send augmented reality kind of off course from all of the wonders that it can do. So I'm just going to kind of throw that out there. What are some of the good things we can see with augmented reality, whether it's through facial recognition, and how can we start using it for good, for whether it's search and rescue and those sort of things. So I'm just kind of throwing that out to whoever wants to jump on that.
The first thing I would say is that as an industry, I think AR should in some ways distance itself from facial recognition, only because that's coming. And I don't know, Brian, you can probably help in the legal front, but you don't have any expectation of privacy if you're walking in a public street. And so if you're using an algorithm to just make it more efficient to identify 10,000 people at once, I don't really think there's any legal defense against that. And neither is there any way to really prevent people from misusing it. So I would almost distance that from augmented reality. I mean, you're looking into reality and getting a face and then examining it. But that type of fear against the loss of privacy, if that is wedded early on to augmented reality, that might actually hurt public perception, would be my view of it. But,
yeah, from a civil legal standpoint, and Kevin mentioned the Fourth Amendment, which is based on a reasonable expectation of privacy. The civil rights to an expectation of privacy, what tort law would protect against an invasion of privacy also looks at what your reasonable expectation is, although that same phrase doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in the Fourth Amendment and the civil context. The civil context is a lot more fluid and decided really case by case. But you're right, the bottom line principle is that you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in what you publicly expose, and what's more publicly exposed when you walk down the street than your face. So that said, I think that the collective definition of what a reasonable expectation is going to have to be fluid and bendable, and the more that you can do with the things that we're currently exposing on the public sphere, on the public street, such as scanning your face and calling up all sorts of information about it, the more that we might have to look at where that line is, and where collectively as a society we might push that line back a little bit to say, well, just because I can see it on the street doesn't necessarily mean I should be allowed to do X, Y, and Z with it. Although I think you're right that eventually we will get there. It's just a question of how quickly. But Brian, I know, has a perspective on this too.
Yeah, there was a dinner conversation that I think was the precursor to my invitation to the panel about just this. And I think that it's important to point out, and like Dan said, separating facial recognition from augmented reality, they're actually very different things. DAQRI is an augmented reality company. We do not do facial recognition, and that's by choice. A lot of similar technologies, but there's privacy issues that need to be addressed, and we feel like where we're at in the market and positioning ourselves, we don't have the or have not expended the energy and really the thought required to address those issues before rolling out a product. And I think that it's definitely a different technology that isn't augmented reality, and we need to be very cautious from privacy standpoint when it comes to that. The application that you mentioned about assisted living, it's actually really exciting to me. It hits close to home with a family member, and so it's always been on our mind and something we've looked at. So there's definitely an upside to it. I'm not a naysayer that thinks that the technology will ruin the world or necessarily has to lead to evil, but a lot of thought has to go into how you collect the information. And some of our early thoughts kind of explore discovery or personal training of a closed loop system. Versus data mining large databases of faces that kind of seems to be where the gray area starts to pop up.
Well, I want to kind of add to that, because this kind of leads to not only facial recognition, but like object recognition, and also on, let's face it, augmented reality is poised to be the greatest way to train people to do things, and whether it's turning them into subject matter experts or having them take through, go through steps to become better. We heard our keynote today talk about Sesame Street, and I started to think to myself he talked about using the potty and that sort of thing, but you could actually train kids through augmented reality how to, whether it's, know where to go to the bathroom or how to lift the toilet seat, whatever the case is, but there's a way that you can use this for training for many different ways. And I think that this is an opportunity from a law enforcement perspective, but from a perspective, we have the medical doctors that are going to be talking about using augmented reality to assist them in operations and that sort of thing. One of my next questions is do we see certain applications that are going to, not even besides law enforcement, but to train people in turning them into, not subject matter experts, but just better to be able to follow instructions, better to do tasks that we might not have normally thought augmented reality was capable of doing. So where do you see that kind of rolling out from augmented reality? And I guess probably, Brian, you're the best person to ask this sort of thing. Are you starting to look at different steps and how to let people follow, to create these sort of applications?
Yes.
Okay, so everything else is top secret, and he can't tell us what they're doing. But, I mean, this is the sort of thing that we see, and I think, Daniel Suarez, in your book, you talk about how, and I don't want to give away the plot, but you talk about how augmented reality can be used, whether it's different layers and of floating information and that sort of thing that can be used to teach people how to do things. And now it's obviously not always the most productive ways for society, but in one positive way, in the book, it talks about how the society learns how to grow, and they have their own agriculture, and they're able to utilize augmented reality in that sort of way. So maybe you could use that.
Basically, somebody using AR to create a networked tribe, to conduct their business in a reality other people can't see. And so this group can move amongst other people and still be a separate society. And I thought that was an interesting idea. And then, of course, there's other people, just like any technology, just like any tool. There's a certain percentage of people who will use it for advantage, and I don't think AR is any different than any other technology that's come along. Metal, fire, somebody's always misusing technology, and there's always a certain group. And I think because this industry is so young, it's important that public perceptions be addressed first, because the reality of it, to me, is that it's just an immensely useful idea, the concept of projecting data, because I'm a database guy. Projecting data on reality in geospatial context just makes so much sense once you see it. It just clicks. And I think everybody in this room would agree with that they're here for that reason. But there will always be that certain percentage, and that public perception, the public out there that barely knows about this or doesn't know about it at all, you definitely don't want their first introduction to it to be on some shrill news story saying that somebody's seeing bubbles over their head with all their data on it. And I don't know, I've designed some scenarios in my books that show how people can use it for good, like you said, or misuse it. So I'm trying to be proportional about it. I'm definitely not a Luddite. I love this technology. I just do think that the public perception of it is really going to be the biggest battle in it, just to make sure that it doesn't get tarred early on with some indelible impression that people will always say, oh, isn't it that technology that takes all my data and steals it from me? And that would be my biggest concern about it. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. You
Do you
did.
mind if I chime in?
Go ahead.
Just from a criminal and commercial standpoint, too, I know there's a lot of concerns with facial recognition and AR and stuff like that perpetuating harmful things, but at the same time, like identity theft and stuff like that. But just the other day, I don't know if anybody, I'm sure people are familiar with Square, but I had just so happened to sign up for Square, a little card reader with the credit card, and I happened to go get a haircut, and actually the stylist had one of the Square readers, and when I swiped my card, my photo popped up. Now, I see that as a positive aspect. Facial recognition is just one step further along to that. It can identify and verify that the person is who they say they are. The reason I put my photo up there on my Square profile is so if anybody ever did obtain my card and tried to use it illegally, that hopefully the person who is, accepting that transaction would notice the difference between me and that person that stole my card. So I see a very kind of a merging, meshing law enforcement, commercial type unity here with helping stop identity theft and fraud in that respect using facial recognition and AR. And I think that's a kind of maybe a niche market that nobody has tapped into yet.
Well, kind of one of the side notes, and this is just a perspective that I have, is that I almost believe because technologies are moving so quickly, and one of the slides shows how technology, how many years it took for technology to reach 50% of the homes in America. And it took the telephone 71 years to reach 50% of the homes in America. And if you look at the iPad or iTouch, it might be 2 years. And, I come from the premise, and I don't know whether people here agree with it or not, or our panel agrees with it or not, but it's almost that as the years go on, we just normally will give up pretty much all of our privacy. We'll give up our privacy and accept that we really, everybody knows where I am, everybody knows what I look like. Right now the two Brians have already been tweeting, and I know where the whole world knows you're in Santa Clara, California, and what you thought of the keynote and how cool it is. So we're slowly giving away kind of our privacy. And when we start thinking about geolocation, which is a big piece of this, when we start mixing augmented reality and geolocation, it's a tremendous amount of information that really could be used for social networking per se and that sort of thing. So I'm curious, do you agree with my premise that we're just normally going to give away our privacy, number one, or is that something that people are still going to hold on to it? And also, where are we moving here with geolocation and really giving, everybody tidbits of more about our life than.
I'm still surprised how many people gave up all their passwords for a Starbucks card. That just, that amazed me. By the way, this $1 million or 1 million email addresses for $49.95. I'll tell you what's really priceless is privacy and quietude. I don't know about you all, but I have a hell of a time going anywhere where it's really quiet. I used to spelunk in caves, and boy, I don't know, I have to go into a cave to get somewhere that's quiet.
I actually think that AR is going to help privacy. I know that seems weird, but let's face it, AR is just data. It's just a visualization of data. And our data is already percolating all over the place. It's going who knows where. Our MEIDs on our phones, they're being recorded, financial transactions, on and on. And the good thing about AR is I think, as it's widely adopted, will allow the public to see with their best evolved apparatus for sensing things, their eyes, to see things happening to them, happening to their data. If that can be visualized, their data being pulled away from them and consumed, then it becomes a much more, something we're evolved to understand. Something that is us, our alter selves, our digital selves, are being predated upon, let's say. And I think AR can help a lot in that regard. So the privacy, again, is a completely separate issue. I think it's actually a battle that might be over in some ways, but AR might help people start to defend themselves against it and get a little more control of it. So I look at it in a very optimistic way.
Jumping off that point, I think that AR will help us refine what the word privacy and the concept of privacy even means. AR, like Dan says, AR in and of itself doesn't offer you necessarily any new data, any new information that you can't get from any other source. What it does is it makes it more visible, and that visibility in itself, that synthesis of data from divergent sources, putting it in a very visible, very easy to digest, and very accessible right in front of your face format, is going to make the same data that we were okay with all of a sudden not okay. It's going to make it feel creepier. I know that somebody can get on Google, find out where I live, spend a half hour searching on my social networks and put together a profile of me that would probably be chilling if I saw it all on paper. But I can live with that because I know it's just out there in diverse sources. But if just by walking down the street someone can just look at me and see all of that information already compiled floating over my head, like the scene in Dan's book where people are walking through a mall and the two protagonists are looking at them with their AR glasses, and they see these people's net worth, their credit scores, all this other financial data aggregated from other places floating over their head, and you can assess the financial worth of this person as you're talking to them. That AR didn't create that data. It didn't come from AR. It came from different places. AR makes it more visible and therefore more powerful. And so that's going to make us reconsider what privacy means and what it should mean, what it should protect. If I can hog the mic for one more thing, the earlier topic we talked about, we started off with this idea of facial recognition, and we kind of want to dance around it a little bit. It's a sensitive subject. We don't want to tarnish the AR brand with too much discussion of the negativity and facial recognition, and they are different technologies. But David's point is a good one. It's inevitable that these two things are going to be enmeshed. David gave a great example for commercial reasons. It makes sense that you'd want to have this information available in certain commercial contexts because it makes those transactions more secure. Also, just from a pure technology standpoint, if nobody loves markers anymore, and nobody really loved them to begin with, but markers were the original way that we recognized that a physical object was out there so that our mobile device could project some digital data on top of it. Well, if we're not going to use markers, how are we going to know what's there? Object recognition is only so good, and we're not. I've blogged a little bit about nano tags, and in the comic book, the name's escaping me. The comic book published out of the UK last year, the Cloak and Dagger comic book that's augmented, and the theme of that book is that they've dispersed these nano-sized taggants everywhere, and so now your AR device can actually read what's going on in the person's mind because they have these nano devices implanted in their skin. Interesting concept. But if we're not going to do that, we need to do the technology, the hardware needs to look at something to figure out what's there. We heard the gentleman from Sesame Street this morning say, well, just projecting static virtual data on top of a static video feed, that's not really AR because it's not interactive. It needs to know what's there and react to it. It needs to mold it around what's happening. And we also heard from Martin Fitzgerald earlier today that Google is pushing their AR eyewear towards social networking because that's what people want to do with digital technologies, interact with human beings. All of these forces, the social networking, the interactivity with our physical environment, the commercial security, in biometrics, facial recognition is just one more biometric. All of this stuff is pushing towards being able to recognize people, and the easiest way to do that is facial recognition. I've talked enough.
You can't talk for the rest of the panel discussion. No, I'm just kidding. Does anybody have any, I'm going to switch gears in a second, but I want to offer, because we do want input from our audience here, does anybody have any questions that go along with this that they want to throw out to the panel, just out of curiosity before I switch gears? So if you do, you could just walk up to the microphone and do that if you want. I just want to make sure we offer. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Hi there. Is this working?
Yeah.
Just on the sort of topic of identity in general, maybe you guys could talk a little bit, or consider at least, sort of the possibility of fragmented realities. When everybody is seeing sort of a different aspect of the world, a different set of annotations and overlays, what does that kind of mean for your various jurisdictions?
For me, I can say it's tremendously useful in fiction. But you look at the profusion of cable channels. I think there was a time for most of us when everybody watched this, network television. And so there was this great cultural connection there. And then, of course, cable, there's 700 channels, and then people start to get into these cliquish groups about what they watch. And then, like you say, if you project those channels, in essence, the content onto reality so that there's an infinite number. It's an array that has an infinite number of elements. Culturally, I don't know. As a fiction writer, it's very interesting to think about. Would I want to wake up tomorrow and have it happen instantly? No, before we thought about it? Yeah, I think it would be a huge impact. I don't know. I think it could divide people as much as it brings people who are not geo-co-located. Could bring those people together, but also could have people who are right next to each other who never see each other because you're always looking at a different dimension they have no interest in. So
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting question from a commercial standpoint. We're exploring it in both directions, both the highly customized world, but then the shared experience augmented reality, which is something that we're just kind of hitting the tip of the iceberg with. You know, today, every time you look at an augmented reality, everybody's kind of having a different experience anyway. It's definitely very solitaire. You know, and actually, I don't know if anybody's seen our cubes today, but it's a really neat experience when you track the object. And we have two versions. We have one where an individual can customize, and we have another where when you're in the same geographic area, if one person makes the change, others see it. That doesn't work in a conference environment because the thing would be changing too fast. But you know, exploring both directions, I think, are just as important. There's a way that even though people can customize what they see in the world with augmented reality, it can also bring them together through a shared experience and a common experience of the virtual as much as the physical.
Yes, sir.
Oh, hello. Yes, David Cox, San Francisco State University. I'm just interested in this notion of hybridity. You know, the customizability of augmented reality technologies means that ordinary people can now customize their experience of the world around them to some extent, much as they would their desktop on their computer. And I noticed the anonymous mask on the table there. One of the great, I think, things about Occupy, for those who support it, as I do, is that it represents a means by which ordinary people can customize their experience of the urban space to lay a claim to something that was previously private and now declare it in the public interest. And I think this notion of customizability I guess, in favour of a broader notion of the commons is one of the greater potentials of augmented reality, away from the notion of objects and data as property.
Speaking of anonymous, you know, capable of what? Good and evil?
No, just good.
Just good. Okay. And certainly that's one of the major points of discussion that's going on in not only in cyberspace, but in the virtual or the real world today, correct? I mean, it's gotten to be a very important topic.
Well, I mean,
when we start defining
anonymous emerged because of, you know, contestations about the role of property, and this is about crime. So
certainly, yeah, lots of interesting discussions there. I'm more than willing to have those discussions offline in the bar. I'm serious about that, quite frankly. May I talk about presidential campaign? You're not supposed to talk about politics or sex here, but.
We might talk about sex.
Unemployment, isn't unemployment a big issue these days? How many of you are looking for jobs right now? Just one?
Wait, are you developers? Because come by the booth.
Just got our job. Good for
Well, let me suggest something to you. If you are looking, or you have children that are looking for a job, or relatives or friends, I teach at the Information School at the University of Washington in Mary Gates Hall, and my students have a 0% chance of being unemployed. We can't get enough people to do this. You know, protecting and serving on the net. My buddy Phil Reidinger, who's now working for Sony, they had this little breach at Sony, and they hired Phil Reidinger, who is former Deputy Undersecretary at DHS, and he said, and Janet, you know, they said, we need to hire 1,000 cybersecurity professionals. I would suggest that's not even going to come close to what they're going to need. So that's why I'm very interested in privacy, and I'm very interested in security. I mean, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Just out of curiosity, have any of you ever taken an oath to support and defend the United States? Fair number of you. Okay.
I study karate. I do it twice a week, but I don't think you've quite answered the question.
Well, I told you I would answer the question in the bar after offline.
Well, I'm going to take a shot at your question because I think it kind of ties into Brian Wassam, because we're talking about, as you said, about customizing your environment through augmented reality, and we see that through advertisers where somebody can go into Times Square and change the ads through augmented reality and almost possess those advertisements, and you're customizing your environment. And with that, I think, comes along some legal issues of that we just have not been addressed yet through the legislature. And we're starting to see these virtual lawsuits roll out, and it'll be interesting to kind of monitor that. So it kind of goes along with your customization of the environment and who really possesses that, who possesses space. We know with TagDis, the app that you can have on the iPhone, or now Wallet, where you can actually put virtual postings out there in cyberspace, what are the ramifications that come along with it? And from a law enforcement perspective, if somebody posts a virtual tag that says, I'm going to kill, so-and-so, is that a real threat? And I think we kind of agree, well, yeah, we have to take any threat serious. And, we're going to, I guess one of the other things is that we're going to see, inevitably with any type of innovation, it's going to be utilized potentially for harm. So, we think about the Wright brothers that took their first powered flight that lasted 12 seconds. Nobody ever thought that that would be used as a missile flying into skyscrapers. So with this as any other innovation, and I know augmented reality is just a part of it. We talked about facial recognition, we talked about geotagging, we talked about all of these other layers that kind of integrate, and we don't want to be disingenuous to augmented reality because it is so amazing, but through all of these different layerings, we're going to start to see some amazing uses, but also some really potentially very devastating uses of it also. And I think that by us having these sort of conversations, whether it's talking about Anonymous and talking about, I know Anonymous had an augmented reality Occupy area where there were certain areas they couldn't even go to in New York City, so they were able to project protesters in the areas that were cordoned off, and that sort of way to express themselves. But I know I kind of rambled on here, but can you just kind of address maybe some of the privacy issues that we talked about, that customizing? Brian, I mean, just from your perspective, I mean, if we're customizing an environment, are we, violating certain people's trademarks or violating their advertising?
Right. Well, it's a great question that requires more time than we have to really dive into it. But we talk about customizing the world for all these political and noble purposes. But what's really going to happen, the bulk of it, is going to be customizing the world for commercial purposes, and that's where we get into the law of trademarks, the law of unfair competition. Right now, this is something I blogged about recently. Online, the courts still haven't sorted out what they want to do with sponsored ads on Google and keyword advertising. If you buy your competitor's trademark as a keyword, it's so that every time somebody searches for it and your ad pops up, is that an unfair use of your competitor's trademark? A lot of courts say, no, that's not unfair, but then recently another court just stuck it to Google for doing exactly that in a lawsuit brought by Rosetta Stone. So when we start using physical objects and people as keywords, so that I look at this bottle of water, it says Santa Clara on it, but I see an ad in my augmented vision for some other brand of bottled water. Yeah, I mean, is that an unfair use of that trademark? Those are going to be very fun issues to litigate. But I know you've been waiting.
Yes.
Well, this is more of a hypothetical or not so hypothetical issue, but what is the legality of, say, the public surveilling law enforcement officers, say, during, a riot or whatever, Occupy event? People fly their drones, this has already occurred in Poland last year, take pictures of, law enforcement officers, and then post their information. And that law enforcement officer possibly did something that, they hit someone or, they arrested someone, and it was violent. And they post that information on the web, and that information may be wrong. But somebody like Spike Jones or Spike Lee or Kanye West posts that information on Twitter. So what's sort of the legality in that situation, and what's going on where all of a sudden random people get, a couple in Florida basically get all sorts of harassing telephone calls, things get thrown in their lawn, that kind of stuff happening, because the public has the same capabilities of surveilling and doing augmented reality and doing facial recognition, plus the number of people willing to do the data research, wrong or right, and posting that information. So
that's a very good question. It's one thing to augment reality; it's another to distort it. But Bruce remembers this. One of the first times I met Bruce was at Computers, Freedom, and Privacy '96, and he's sitting in the bar there and introduced me to Jim Metcalf. And Jim was the first guy I met that had an IP address in the blinds in his home. And the caption I put under Bruce's picture on my webpage said, "This guy's brain ought to be registered as an incendiary device," which is very true. But I also met a guy by the name of Steve Mann. How many of you ever heard of Steve Mann? Yeah, really interesting guy. He came up with the great term surveillance, which is exactly what you're talking about. I have no problem with that at all. If you're in the public and if law enforcement has the right to video you, you certainly have the right to video law enforcement. And if it'll help keep these cops obeying the law while they enforce it, more power to you. Go out there and video to your heart's content. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Briefly, I'll pass it back to Joe. I've actually litigated this issue up to a state Supreme Court, and there have been a dozen or more of these cases all over the country, and in every single one of them, the cops lose. The First Amendment protects the right to videotape public servants doing their public duty in public.
It's even better when the public servants video themselves, like GSA. Some of you must know what I'm talking about. I used to work for GSA. I saw this coming 30 years ago, folks. I mean,
as a police officer, I have to talk on this one. No, as Brian just said, I mean, as law enforcement officers, if we're being filmed and that sort of thing, that we have a right to just basically do our jobs, protect the public. A lot of times you have demonstrations and that sort of thing. We have to do our jobs. I think when we start looking at issues of drones, and you said the magic word, because if you know anything about me, I always want to talk about drones and how it could be tied into augmented reality, because I think there's a lot of big issues, especially when we start incorporating facial recognition. But the Poland protest that you mentioned, which is a video that I love to look at, the drone actually, I believe it was flown by the media. And the media is using drones to the paparazzi to spy on people and that sort of thing. And I think that when drones start getting into a place where they're unlawfully supposed to have access, just like a peeping Tom looking through your bedroom window, they're not allowed to be outside your window doing that. I think that drones, one of the concerns of mine is a civilian use of drones where it can put people in risk, whether it's a protest, whether it's giving away law enforcement maneuvers to protect the public. And I know you might not think of the law enforcement making maneuvers to protect, because they're really there to protect an environment or to try to make it as safe when you have riots and people are overturning cars and that sort of thing. That's anarchy, and the law enforcement are in the role to prevent that from taking place and protecting people's property and also people from physical harm. So it's a very fine balance. I know a lot of people are scared of Big Brother, and as we know, the Electronic Freedom Foundation came out with the Freedom Information Act, which basically asked the FAA who actually has access to drones and what are they doing with them and that sort of thing. And there's an article that's up on my blog that out of the 61 agencies or organizations that got approval from the FAA, 25 of them were universities. So it's kind of interesting to see. I think nobody wants Big Brother, and we don't want that sort of environment, but I'm more concerned with some of the criminal element taking advantage of these sort of drones and invading people's privacy and putting people in harm's way. And some of the, for instance, there was a situation where you had protesters over animal rights flying a drone over the hunters that were hunting in an area, and the hunters shot down the drone. I think we're going to see more civilian issues on civilian issues with drones than law enforcement and that sort of thing. I think one of the concerns is that some law enforcement are talking about utilizing drones, and I'm envisioning it from an AR perspective, that they're looking to put pepper spray or non-lethal deadly force. My concern is the use of hacking, and that's kind of probably we can end out the conversation today. We got about 10 minutes on how hacking is going to basically, if we have a hacked drone that tases an innocent civilian, he's going to come out of the woodwork, and all the other lawyers, But, those are my concerns, is that when we start putting that sort of power, and what are the drones doing? But I've spoken to law enforcement that are utilizing drones to, like, one drone in Texas found the body of a young little boy that had died and was missing, and the drone actually found the boy's body. which they did searching where they couldn't. And if we think about utilizing augmented reality markers, we can do a grid search and utilize it for that sort of thing. So it's to make a long answer to your question, I think if law enforcement, we have the obligation, we have to uphold our Constitution. If we do it in a proper way and we're well trained, we're going to utilize these sort of things in a safe manner, and at the same time protecting everybody's rights, because whoever is there, if you're lawfully protesting in a safe area and you have the right to do it, I mean, that's the beauty of this country. So it's a fine balance on that.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah, I could.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I was going to ask you a question.
Oh, okay, so go ahead.
So I actually have a couple of comments on that. One, the idea of drones with tasers is horrifying. Two, one of the things I liked most about Dan's books was this kind of concept about crowdsourcing even military assets in these communities, and the idea that the average person could bring down an asset and apply it, I think is an interesting perspective in this question of civilian versus public use of drones and use of technologies in these situations. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
It's sort of using an AR interface to turn people into a swarm, to coordinate their activities as if they're all agents enacting a collective will. That's essentially what it is. No individual knowing exactly what you're doing, what the goal is, but getting your limited instruction set. So that's just a nefarious use of it, sort of taking people. I wanted to ask the other Brian a question, actually, about, we talked a little bit about movements of the police during a riot, and I seem to remember it was one of the G20 meetings or something like in Pittsburgh, where somebody was tweeting the location of the police. And I was really curious what the legality was there, because again, being in a public street, 100 cops, it's no expectation of privacy, clearly. So, if you could.
You wouldn't think so, but that highlights the very real problem that the rules of a free society bring. When we want to say, okay, the line is whatever you see in public, you can share unrestrictedly. That's the downside. That's the cost we have to live with. But the G whatever summit it is that's happening right now or soon in Chicago, for example. I think it's G8. The state of Illinois had passed a law against filming police in public, and that got struck down on First Amendment grounds. Yeah, that's even more scary, right? But it got struck down on First Amendment grounds, and the recent word from them is that they weren't going to try to enforce this law. They're trying to uphold it in the courts, but in the meantime, they just kind of threw up their hands and say, don't worry, we're not going to try to enforce this on you during the summit, because we know that people are going to be doing the exact same thing in Chicago that they were there.
I mean, I get it that in the military, you don't want the enemy, filming your movements, but it's civil. It's a civil disagreement. So.
One of the first times this took place visually was GSA, actually. Again, getting back to GSA, they were wearing helmet cams at, I think it was the RNC or the DNC a number of years back, and they're not using them anymore. So aside from the legalities, we have to really be concerned with the perception of abuse of power, abuse of authority.
Well, and I don't know, it seems to a good question to ask if these drones are in a position where they have tactical awareness around a riot and an unsafe situation. Why can't I, as a citizen, get access to the video feed to find a safe exit that if I just don't want to get beat up and I want to get out? I mean, it seems like maybe some of that intelligence would be valuable to the average person.
Let me, I'm not going to forget your question, but I wanted to touch on this because Daniel just said the word swarm. And that's just another issue. Has anybody seen the Vijay Kumar video, the TED 2012, where the swarm is playing musical instruments and that sort of? Just raise your hand if you've seen that video. That was amazing, and I started just to think about how to utilize augmented reality. And we could put the good hat on and the bad hat on separately. But the power of these sort of drones, and to be able to do that, and I had a podcast dedicated solely to that, and nobody downloaded it, and I was heartbroken. Because this is so passionate to me that this is amazing what you can do with these technologies. And when you start coupling augmented reality, whether it's an overturned tanker and the swarm goes out and looks for good, and then we could put on the evil cap and think how the swarm can do bad things. And then as they take a Microsoft Kinect and put it on here, and it's able to, on the fly, create a 3D model by bouncing the infrared beams off. I mean, that's just unbelievable. Actually, what a coincidence. I didn't plan that, by the way. That's Vijay Kumar right there. So these sort of things, I mean, there's just so much good and bad that can be done with this, but that's why it's so important for us to have these discussion nows and have these sort of debates. I love getting access to the drone feed. I don't know if that's going to happen, Brian, but that was really interesting. So let's take one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was curious if you start thinking about controlling the message as one of the nefarious ways of doing AR. Like I see AR as just, I believe you brought it up, it's just more of accessibility. The data's there, we're just visualizing it for people. But controlling the message, I'm sure what I could do, if I was sneaky about it, I could put little sensors under everybody's chair and have the iPhone little message blip that says you have a text message, and then I could have everybody go and check their text messages at the exact same time. It's something like that where that's the very first level of something that could be so, like we're saying, nefarious, where say another agency or another, evildoer of some sort says, okay, well, I want to try to make this group of people do something to my means, but using AR as a tool. I'm curious if anybody's thought about that one.
Yeah. I actually wrote a whole book about that. Yeah, and it was very nefarious in some ways. But see, I was combining the aspect that if you have not even a Turing test, let's say a narrow AI, it's not attempting to be of human intelligence. It's basically a macro on steroids, reading the news, and trying to achieve a goal by recruiting people and paying them to do things, and then monitoring the news for the completion of that task. And that's essentially what it was. The people that, in this case, the demon was giving the task, it was also giving them a means to look into an AR, an augmented reality, very different layers, personal layers, collaborative layers, to coordinate their movements. And I tried to use very real technology in it to try to make it as gripping and involving as possible. And plus, again, I come from a data background, and I did see the projection of this data onto geospatial to be useful for doing everything, good, bad, indifferent. And so really, that criminality, I think, is just going to be a reflection of us. Us as a society. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but there's always going to be just some dicks who are going to screw things up. And how do you inoculate any system, whether it's a database system, stop users from hurting themselves, or stop people who want to project power? You just have to compartmentalize it. And certainly AR is just a different form factor for that same question, would be how I put it. So.
Okay, I just want to wrap up because we got about 1 minute left. We talked about a lot of different things here today, and as you could tell, we could talk for hours about this and really get into all of these detailed topics. But the most important thing, and I want to end on the note that everybody up here, we are huge supporters of augmented reality. We want augmented reality to go forward in an extremely positive direction, and that's why I really appreciate the organizers of the conference to recognize this. And I'm really impressed at first when we started this, the talk, I thought it was going to be a ghost town, but everybody started to come in, and I just commend everybody coming in here because you guys are the intellectuals. You're the ones that are looking in the distance to have these sort of conversations. And I think that everybody that attends this conference is just light years ahead when it comes down to innovation and moving technology forward. Everybody here at this conference recognizes that, and that I just wanted to commend everybody for that. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed our conversations, and we have cards up here, and check out all of our blogs and our podcasts and all that other stuff, and we're going to continue to have these debates. So thanks for attending. I appreciate it.